Well, Caroline Elliott, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
You said, quote, "There's no question Canada has a racist past." Your opponent, your reformer, as a result, calls you carbon tax Caroline. They'll point to a CBC interview you gave in March 2024 in which you said, quote, "There is a role for safe supply."
I have been a very conservative person. I spoke in the media for a long, long time for the most right-wing party available and viable in BC, which was the BC Liberal Party. Honestly, I implore Conservatives, please think about what we need to do to defeat the NDP.
No BC Premier has ever invoked a Notwithstanding clause. Why would the trans issue be the issue that would make you break that precedent?
It's actually not the only issue I would use it on. Like involuntary care, which we were just talking about, that's another really good example.
Why do you think you're the best one out of the candidates?
The things that I've been speaking up on, whether it's like speaking up for free speech at the height of cancel culture, speaking up against this radical land back agenda, speaking up against DEI and all the horrible identity politics that's dividing us as a society, like those were all really hard to do at the time I was doing them.
Very quickly, have you ever done a land acknowledgement?
Journalism commentary 1 year anniversary.
I don't believe journalism being funded by the government is the solution.
Rebuild the foundation.
You have to retell the stories.
Market conservative
Other news that actually matters.
I hence wanted to ask. I think they should answer their questions, especially if they're politically charged.
Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. There are objectively a lot of problems in NDP-run British Columbia. If I were to list all of them, I would be here all day. In fact, I could probably make an entire podcast episode dedicated to the problems happening in BC under Premier David Eby. But there is something else happening in British Columbia, and that is people are beginning to turn on David Eby, the NDP, and their socialist agenda. A recent poll found that David Eby is now one of the most unpopular premiers in Canada, and some polls have the BC Conservatives, who are currently the opposition, in first place. Amidst all of this, there are 5 people running to lead that BC Conservative Party in hopes to take it into the next election and defeat David Eby. And one of these people is a woman named Caroline Elliott. Caroline Elliott is a political commentator. She holds a PhD in Canadian liberal democracy from Simon Fraser University, and she has been around in BC politics for some time. Elliott joined me for an interview. We discussed the many problems plaguing BC under David Eby. We talked about her proposed solutions, which include a slate of anti-woke policies. And I asked her some tough questions regarding some of the controversies that have surrounded her campaign and about previous statements that she had made that have raised some eyebrows. Nothing was off the table in our conversation, and Caroline Elliott gave some eye-opening answers that you need to see for yourself. But before we get to this must-watch interview, then please make sure you're subscribed, comment your thoughts down below, hit the notification bell, and consider getting a paid subscription because, unlike the legacy media, I take $0 from the federal government.
Well, Caroline Elliott, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So how would you describe the state of British Columbia after 9 years of the NDP?
Well, it's bad. We are stagnating economically. We have a massive fiscal mess. We have, huge uncertainty over the land base. We have a public safety disaster. Our healthcare system's broken. Our education system's full of activism. Like, you name it, it's not working very well. And it's one of the reasons I threw my name in the ring for the leadership race, is to try to combat that myself personally. Like, I've been writing about a lot of these issues for many years. I've been advocating for them. I've been working in some of these sectors. And I just realized, like, I can expect other people to make the change we need, or I can step up and try to make that change myself.
So former Conservative leader Erin O'Toole, he recently said in an interview that Conservatives should not be fighting a culture war. I've been reading some of your writing and you've made the opposite case, that Conservatives should be fighting the culture war. So could you explain why that is and why you think that a Conservative party in British Columbia that fights the culture war is a party that is better off politically?
Well, look, like, and I get so frustrated with the argument that we shouldn't, because it's not either or. Like, there's so many people who are like, we need to focus on what counts, and that's affordability, and that's the economy. Of course, those things matter. They matter deeply. But if we can't understand as conservatives that the problems underlying those issues are deep and cultural, then we're not actually going to be, we may win the battle here and there, but we will not win the war. And the NDP has been pulling, in the left, more generally, progressives, if we want to call them that, have been pulling their end of the tug of war rope for so long in one direction. And we've just stood there with our hands up doing nothing about it. So we have, and I'll explain what I mean a little bit. Like, take like the NDP's radical land back agenda. Like, that leads to real, concrete, serious challenges for the economy, to the point where now that uncertainty has caused investment to flee from BC, and our economy is stagnating. And we have private property rights undermined at the same time. Like, if we think that this permissive sort of, social justice approach to crime and and addictions doesn't lead to small businesses being run out of their shops, as arson and graffiti and vandalism takes its toll. Like, all of these things have very real consequences in real life. And if we, again, as conservatives, don't understand the depth of that, the fact that the activism in our schools and the sort of net zero, or not zero, but they're sort of the strong like climate bent that's happening in schools, and the vilification of our natural resource sector doesn't lead to a whole generation of people who don't understand the importance of our natural resource sector and what it contributes to our economy and to our services. So those are just some examples, but it's not either or. It has to be both if we're actually going to make the change we need.
One place where we see the culture wars being actively fought are in schools, because unfortunately you have some teachers, not all, some, that go into schools today, and many would say instead of educating, they're indoctrinating, they're bringing their politics, they're bringing their flags, etc. In light of this, alternative schools have become quite popular across Canada, but in many provinces they can come at a cost. In Alberta, there are charter schools where there are alternative schools where people can send their kids to at no cost. So a two-part question for you, Caroline. Number one, what is your plan to deal with the wokeness in BC schools? And number two, do you support, or are you open to the idea of having charter schools in British Columbia?
Thank you. Yeah, this truly is one of my most motivating issues for me personally, because I'm a mom of two young kids who are in the school system, in the public school as we speak. So I'm seeing firsthand what they come home with. They're taught exclusively about the sins of the past and never about our collective successes. They're being told that the land that they stand on doesn't belong to them. You have like conversations happening between the school system and kids that are much more appropriately had between parents and their kids. And in fact, parents are being shut out, and this is under the realm, in this case, of things like SOGI. You've got the BCTF, which is the teachers union here, advocating for and providing resources on their website for like pronoun switching games for kindergartners in grade 1. Like, it's completely wrong. But this is what I'll say is, like, I think the public has never been more ready for this conversation, because they're so acutely aware of how wrong it is in terms of the direction we've been going. And meanwhile, by the way, like, while all that activism is happening in our schools, outcomes are falling in terms of literacy and numeracy and all these other things. So get back to a focus on core basics, like pull all the activism out of the curriculum. And I always say this, like, I'm not advocating for conservative partisan ideology to put in the school system either. It's pull the activism out, full stop. And that's what we need to see. That's what we're not seeing under the NDP. And so that's where I'd start. I think it's crucially important that we do. It's a whole generation of future citizens that we have emerging out of the system here, having learned those things. So yeah, to the second part of your question, I support school choice. I want to see more school choice. I don't know exactly what form that takes at this stage, but I definitely think, like, just philosophically, the more choices we can provide, the more we can put parents in the driver's seat of the way their kids learn and what they're learning, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Another issue that's pretty big in BC, and this one has received international attention. I know there are YouTubers and journalists that have flown from all over the world into Vancouver, and it's to cover the drugs, homelessness issue, and the mental health crisis. And it's most visible in the downtown east side of Vancouver. I was just there with my team last weekend, and it's quite bad out there. In light of this, there are some politicians in BC that have stated that it is time to reopen mental health institutions to give people compassionate care, because leaving them on the streets is not compassionate. So do you support reopening mental health institutions? And what are your thoughts on mandatory treatment for people that are dealing with substance abuse?
Yeah, so I totally support both of those things. We need to, like, any person walks down to, as you did to the other day, to the downtown east side, ask anybody just to open their eyes and look around and ask them if it's working. Like, not one person is going to say yes, like, let's do more of this. It is chaos. It's immoral. It's not compassionate. These people are suffering overdose after overdose after overdose, often resulting in severe brain injuries where they can't actually necessarily reintegrate even if they were treated for their addictions. Like, this is a disaster, and every day we let it continue, there's more people who die, there's more people who end up with severe brain injuries, and there's more people unable to walk around in key areas of their towns in safety and security. So this is a complete lose-lose the way we're doing it. We have to focus those resources that are going to all these other things right now that are just perpetuating the cycle of addiction, and refocus them into institutions where people can actually get well, including on an involuntary basis in cases where that's necessary.
Somebody that has become very controversial in BC is Bonnie Henry. She was very controversial for her COVID mandates, but also for the way that she's dealt with the opioid issue. Would you fire Dr. Bonnie Henry if you become premier?
Yeah, and I've said this publicly. And the reason, and like, people will say, oh, it's because of vaccines or it's this. It's, look, her record is actually atrocious. Like, if you actually look at what she's doing, she's spending, and like, she's supposed to be worrying about like this overdose situation we have in BC, this addictions crisis, this, pandemic planning, sure, like all those kinds of things that a public health officer is supposed to think about. What's she doing? She's writing endless reports on unlearning white supremacy. She's literally signing reports saying, I'm a 5th generation Welsh Scottish settler on unceded whatever territory. Like, she is an activist. And furthermore, she was part of the group who was denying what was happening with safe supply, so-called safe supply, getting into the hands of young people. She's been advocating for a more radical decriminalization experiment than we've already seen from this government, which was already way too far. Her entire ideology is completely out of step with the direction we need to be going in BC. So there's a lot of reasons to believe that she needs to move on.
At the Conservative debate hosted by the Canada Strong and Free Network, which I'll put a link in the description for those who haven't watched it, there was a scrum afterwards, and I asked you 2 questions. One of those questions was if you would invoke the Notwithstanding clause to implement your policy that you have in your platform of banning transgender surgeries for minors and to make women's spaces exclusively for biological women.
Hello, Ms. Elliott. Ellie Cantin-Nantel with EMCN Media. Your platform promises to ban transgender surgeries for minors and to give women's spaces for biological women. You will likely face a legal challenge from activists if that's implemented. Would you be willing to use a Notwithstanding clause to put that into policy?
I would.
That clip went viral. I think it's at almost 500,000 views. Wow. So clearly a lot of people are interested in this or have thoughts about this. Caroline, no BC Premier has ever invoked a Notwithstanding clause. So why would the trans issue be the issue that would make you break that precedent? And why do you think it's needed for that if an activist judge strikes it down?
Yeah, the Notwithstanding clause is a really important tool that elected people, legislatures, can use to undo or sort of limit the impact of unelected judges interfering in what they think is the right thing for their province, right? And so it's actually not the only issue I would use it on. Like involuntary care, which we were just talking about, that's another really good example where, an activist judge might say, oh, well, you're infringing on their freedom to be sort of heavily addicted to drugs on the streets with no protections. Well, my view is that's not freedom. That's not freedom. No one thinks that being imprisoned by addiction is freedom. And in fact, we have to free them from that by taking them into a care, even if it's involuntary at first. And in the long term, it will be good for them. And so gender surgeries for minors is not the only issue that I would use the Notwithstanding clause on, if necessary. But it is one that I would use that clause on, if judges were to intervene in our policy direction on that front. It's important to make sure that we're protecting our kids from irreversible, lifelong surgeries that could prevent them from living fulfilling and happy lives in the long term.
So while I was in BC last week, I went and spoke to a woman who has a condo in Richmond who is affected by the Cowchan decision. Basically, this is a court decision that many say puts private property in jeopardy, and she's received the letters and she's quite concerned about her property. If you ask me, I think this is one of the biggest stories in British Columbia. It's very concerning. Sweet. So as Premier, how would you deal with this situation to give these private property owners, because it's not just in Richmond, there's one up in Kamloops now. There's lots of other cases coming up. How would you give property owners certainty that their land will remain their land?
Yeah, you're right. Thank you for pointing out this isn't just a Richmond issue, although it is first and foremost a Richmond issue. It's an issue that will be a problem anywhere where Aboriginal title is claimed over private property, and particularly where Aboriginal title is actually found by the courts to exist over private property. This is an issue, again, that I've been speaking up for a long time. When the BC government had the policy precedent of the Haida Agreement, which first placed Aboriginal title over private property. They set that policy precedent. I was a huge critic of that. I was writing about it at the time, saying these kinds of rights cannot coexist or we're going to end up in a world of chaos. Sure enough, Cowichan decision comes down. It references the Haida Agreement as a policy preference or precedent, and we find, in fact, this is chaos, and that's exactly what's happening in BC. So I will absolutely stand up for private property rights, and I can tell you how. Like in one thing that people don't realize is that when our government lawyers, the ones that British Columbian taxpayers pay to represent the public interest, when those lawyers were in the courts arguing supposedly on our behalf for the public interest in the Cowichan case, David Eby had issued a directive preventing them from making certain arguments to protect private property. And that directive is still in place, even for the appeal and in all the other Aboriginal title cases taking place in BC right now. So the first thing I would do is I would rescind that directive and say you can make every argument. In fact, you must make every argument to protect private property and the public interest. I would also make sure that we're appealing decisions that come down from the courts, even outside of Aboriginal title, but on other issues under Section 35 of the Constitution. Make sure that we're actually appealing those when they don't go our way, making sure we're putting our best our arguments ahead and forward so that we're properly protecting the public interest.
5 years ago, there was a bombshell story out of Kamloops. Then the report was that there could be 215 unmarked graves of children at a former residential school site. And this, in many ways, was the catalyst for the land back movement. There was kind of a reckoning that summer. A lot of the statues were pulled down. Land acknowledgments became much more common. The flags were put at half-mast, et cetera, et cetera. Now, 5 years later, and no physical remains have been unearthed or formally confirmed. This whole story has caused a lot of debate and controversy, including in BC. There are some people who are saying that the whole thing was a misinterpretation, and then others are accusing those people of being deniers and of dismissing the stories of survivors. So it's a very polarizing issue. What are your thoughts on this whole issue, the story, and how would you navigate this as Premier?
Yeah, it's one of those issues where it's become impossible to even have a conversation about it. And that's not right. I think that we need to be able to converse, to share our different views of a situation and be able to have that conversation without talking about arresting people as the federal NDP would have us do, right? They've talked about for literal jail time for what they call residential school denialism. Well, asking factual questions, talking about the evidence or lack thereof, those are reasonable things to do that shouldn't come with jail time being proposed over top of it. And so this is what I mean when we've lost our ability to have the conversation. When people are bringing up this issue on university campuses and have to be escorted away by police for their own, apparently, allegedly for their own safety or whatever the rationale is given there, like that's a problem. We need to be able to say, look, like we can acknowledge that that awful things happened at residential schools. We can acknowledge that. We know it. While also saying it's important to stick to facts and evidence in things like, if you're familiar with it, the issue that got Dallas Brody fired from caucus ultimately was around training materials used by the Law Society of BC in the training of lawyers. And I'm just giving this as an example. They use the words 215 graves. And an individual in the Law Society said, well, we'd like the word potential because we don't know, in fact, that there are 215 graves. That set off such a controversy, the suggestion of the addition of the word potential, and he was denigrated and called a really bad, all kinds of really bad names and so on. And it started this firestorm. we need to be able to have a conversation about accuracy in legal training materials. Like we need to, this is the pool from which our future judges are drawn, right? So it is crucially important that evidence and facts are accurately represented in the information put in front of people. So and I just raised that as a conversation, as an instance of where a conversation was, I think, could have been reasonably had, and instead went in a totally crazy direction where people are getting fired, people are being called racist, people are going to court, and so on. So can we bring back nuance? Can we bring back a nuance that says, look, like on the one hand, no one thinks residential schools were utopia. Bad things happened at residential schools. At the same time, were they, genocide and up there with the very, very worst of human history? We know that, at least as far as I'm concerned, neither of those things are true. And we need to be able to have a conversation about what the facts actually are. Sorry, that was a long answer.
It's all good, Caroline. You brought up Dallas Brody. She has started her own party, the One BC Party, and a poll had them at 10%, over 10% recently. One of your opponents, Yuri Fulmer, has proposed to have a deal to unite the right, and his concern is that, well, if there's a vote split, David Eby could get another term. So, how do you plan to deal with a potential second party from the right? How would you unite the right in BC, and would you be open to welcoming Dallas Brody, Tara Armstrong, and some of the others who left the caucus during the previous leader back into the party?
Yeah, look, like the vote split's a really serious question, and it's a question on both sides, to be honest, of the political spectrum, depending on who wins and what kind of which party on which side gets a little more air in their tires as a result. And it's one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I think that I can cover the most breadth of support in this party and actually make sure this party sticks together and that we don't lose the next election as a result of a split. So yeah, like I've been very outspoken on the land issue, on the sort of this radical land back agenda that the NDP has been pursuing. I was out there before anyone else was, including anyone from One BC, speaking up on this issue back when it was very, very politically difficult to do so. And as a result, I have many of their fundraisers supporting fundraising for me. I have many of their members joining the party to support me. I think that's how we do it, is we make sure that we're covering, that end of the spectrum and then also the other end of the spectrum in terms of making sure we have a broad enough support base to form government. That said, what Yuri Fulmer is proposing to do is two things. One, he's like, I can't imagine running for the leadership of a party on the premise that you're going to form a minority government beholden to a different political party. To me, that's completely crazy. And two, he's not undoing the divide. He is institutionalizing the divide. He's making it permanent. So instead of making the party broad enough for those folks to feel like they can be part of this thing, he's actually drawing a line down and saying, okay, well, it's one or the other and you have to choose. So I don't think that's right. And I think his plan is destined for failure.
Reading your platform and having heard you speak a few times in person when I was out in BC, you're positioning yourself, if we're to go by what you're saying right now and with your platform, as one of the most, if not the most conservative premiers in Canada. If you were to become premier, you have a very, very strongly conservative platform. However, some of your opponents and some political commentators in BC have criticized you for comments you've made in the past, and I'll give you a couple that I verified myself. They'll point to a CBC interview you gave in March 2024 in which you said, quote, "There is a role for safe supply. It can stabilize folks," unquote. On the carbon tax, you gave an interview to Global News in which you said, the idea behind it is to do something that discourages people or dissuades them from using fossil fuels more than they need to. And your opponent, Yuri Fulmer, as a result, calls you carbon tax Caroline. And in an op-ed you wrote in The Hub, you said, quote, "There's no question Canada has a racist past," unquote. So could you explain these statements? Are these taken out of context? Have you maybe evolved on your views? How should voters interpret them? Because people are talking about them.
Yeah, look, what I would say is look at my record of what I have said and done for years and years and years. They're very, I have been a very conservative person. Was involved with the federal Conservatives prior to Stephen Harper even getting elected. I remember being at a rally he held in Surrey in like 2006 or something like that, like 20 years we're talking about. So to me, it's not about like, are you conservative or are you liberal? I did a lot of punditry, right? I spoke in the media for a long, long time for the most right-wing party available and viable in BC, which was the BC Liberal Party. A lot of people from other provinces don't know. In BC, there were two parties that were viable for the entirety of my adult life until 2024 or so. And those were the BC Liberal Party or the NDP. And so many federal conservatives like me were involved in the BC Liberal Party. It was just the only party available to us for decades, since about 1991. So I did a lot of commentary in the media as part of that. And yeah, so talking about like characterizing that party's stance on various issues like the carbon tax was part of what I did in that role. And I think that's fine. I oppose the carbon tax. I would never contemplate bringing one in BC. Talking about safe supply, look, I was clear even in those comments, our focus has got to be on treatment, which is exactly the position I have today. And it's true that on the safe supply issue or so-called safe supply issue, the government, including the public health officer, spent a lot of time defending and suggesting that the things that were happening were not happening, like so-called safe supply getting into the hands of teenagers and kids, like it being diverted and being traded in for more lethal stuff. That has come to light steadily. So we have to take kind of some of these comments into account in terms of the context we were in, where a lot of that stuff had not come to light at that time. But what I would say is I've been absolutely consistent that our focus needs to be on recovery. Even in that exact statement you read out, that was actually the crux of the argument I was making. On the last one, because I want to address all of them, this idea, no question, Canada has a racist past. Of course, like every single country has a racist past. We know this. That's not a gotcha. That's like, let's use our brains and look around. My point is, Canada has a racist past. Of course it does. The US has a racist past. It had slavery. Every single country has a racist past. And the comments I was making there was saying Canada is no different than every other country in the world in that past. The reality is we're a country made up of good people who are actually incredibly tolerant and kind. And we should be proud of our history and proud of our present day.
Very quickly, have you ever done a land acknowledgement?
Never. And keep in mind, I spent years and years in academia. Years doing public commentary, years doing public debates, So it's interesting to see some of my fellow contenders like Mr. Fulmer, who talk a lot about living on stolen land and how we're all settlers. Like these are words that have come out of his mouth. He's saying, "Oh, well, I kind of had to do it. Like I was sort of made to do it." It's like, no, you weren't. You can be a leader. You can stand up and you can say, "I'm not doing these things." I sure never did.
You already mentioned previously you were involved with the BC Liberals, BC United. I did have a little disclaimer in my question about the past and how, as you just mentioned, it was the Free Enterprise Coalition. It was basically the capitalists that were federal liberals and federal conservatives uniting against the socialist, the NDP. But some people have pointed out, and I've verified this myself, that you kept donating to the BC United after the last election. And the latest donation I could find was a $50 donation in December 2024. So could you explain why you kept making donations to BC United?
Of course, yeah. So there's something called a sustaining donation. You set it up on your credit card and it just gets taken off your credit card every single month. And that's, if you look back in those same records, it will show one for December, November, October, September, and, going back forever. One thing and as you know, so I played a key role in standing that entire party down to make sure that the vote was not split so the Conservatives could win. I spent that election door knocking for Conservative candidates. I sacrificed my own candidacy to make sure that the vote was not split, and went out and actually door knocked for the Conservative candidate who had originally been running against me. So it's incredible to see people say like, "Oh, you're not committed enough to the cause." I don't know what else could suggest that level of commitment other than my record, which is standing that party down and standing down for my own candidacy. In terms of the ongoing donations, I will say it was tough. Like I had friends who were staff in that party who were worried about, having given up our party running, we had no longer had any donations coming in. That meant that staff who were there, who were trying to sort of sort out the aftermath of all of that, were worried about, were they going to get paid? Were they going to, be able to, were we going to be able to make our commitments as a political party? So the last thing I was about to do was call up those staff, friends of mine, and say, cancel my donations and put your future paycheck in jeopardy. I wasn't going to do that. It was the right thing to do, and I'll stand by it any day of the week.
You hired for your team, you have some people from BC on your team, but you also hired some prominent consultants from Ontario and Quebec to go on your campaign, including Doug Ford's campaign manager and pollster. You faced scrutiny from other candidates, including at one of the debates, and these other candidates were boasting about having primarily BC, if not fully BC teams. So I wanted to get you the opportunity to explain, why did you choose to hire people from outside the province to help run your campaign?
So look, I have an awesome team. Like I have people from right here in BC in senior leadership team, senior leadership roles, and I have people from outside the province also in senior leadership roles. This is what building a winning team looks like, and we have to stop being so parochial in this province. I implore Conservatives, please think about what we need to do to defeat the NDP. And what we need to do is actually what the NDP itself does: bring in the best talent from all over the country, and they bring those guys in right here to BC. And guess what they do? They won in 2017, they won in 2020, they won in 2020 or 2024. I'm kind of tired of losing. I want to make sure that we actually have a team who can win. So let's stop being so silly about, provincial barriers, and say, let's bring in the best of the best from all around this country and actually win this thing. And that includes BC talent, because some of the best in the country is right here in BC, which I'm very proud to have them on my team.
If you succeed in becoming BC Conservative leader and premier, and whoever you end up hiring to advise you then, and they come to you and they say, Caroline, if you want to win the general or you want to get reelected, you're going to have to flip-flop on some of your current positions. This is something we've seen in the past with other Conservative politicians, most famously Erin O'Toole. What would your response be to that advice?
Look, I am not running for fun or to have my name on a door or to have a fancy election sign. Like, I'm not doing this to be in a certain role. I'm doing this because I really, really care about the issues that I'm fighting for. And they are issues, if you look back in my record, my writing going back years, I've been pushing and advocating for these things forever. And I'm doing it for my kids. I'm doing it for an entire generation of people. And I'm doing it not for fun, but because I want to get these things done. So I'm not here to backtrack. I'm not here to get elected and then suddenly turn around and say I'm going to turn into, some loose, mushy middle sort of coalition. I'm here because I want to scrap DRIPA. I want to restore private property rights. I want to end the activism in our schools. I want to, clean up our streets and get this absolute disaster under control that's happening out there. So I want to get our economy firing on all cylinders. I want to restore fiscal balance. Like, these are all things I want to do. And handily enough, they are all things that what I'm promising to do are going to actually achieve. So there's no reason, as far as I'm concerned, to back down from any of that. In fact, I think that British Columbians are going to be pretty well on board and excited about it.
Before launching your campaign, you co-launched an independent media site called Without Diminishment. We've seen independent media become very popular, especially in the conservative movement. And that site has gained really incredible momentum and viewership. What role do you think independent media has in the future of both the conservative movement and broader Canadian politics?
I think independent media is great, and I like to support it in any way I can, including doing, interviews like this. I was doing interviews with Juno a lot before jumping into this. In fact, I just did one. I filmed one earlier today. There's other outlets I could point to who are doing really good work. Without Diminishment, that publication that I co-founded has been incredible. It's been so popular, and the coolest thing in the world is going to an event. I'm not involved in the day-to-day, obviously, of that anymore, and they've been very, very good about staying politically incredibly neutral during this race, and that's the right thing for them. But I was lucky enough to attend a function that they had recently, and looking around that room, it was sold out. The youth in that room, like the relative age, the energy is like palpable. It's so cool to see. And I think that is a lot of what's going on with independent media. It's younger, it's more energized, it's more principled. And so I think it's great. I think that there's anything I can do to support them is important. It doesn't mean that we don't do traditional media. Like, there is a role for that too. I do those interviews and all those things, but I think that there's a different opportunity. It's a very different kind of ecosystem, if you will. And I think that it's not one or the other. It's definitely both for me.
Caroline, my last question to you is, you are running against 4 other people. to be BC Conservative leader. Why do you think you're the best one out of the candidates?
Well, look, I think one is I recognize that the depth of the ideological problem in BC and how aggressively the NDP has pushed that ideology into every single aspect of public life. And it's a commitment to not sort of tinker around the edges of, tax cuts and deregulation as much as we need to do those things, but actually diving in there and pulling it out by its roots and doing a very big reset of the way we do government in British Columbia. So that's one part of it. The other thing I would say is it's courage. Like the things that I've been speaking up on, whether it's like speaking up for free speech at the height of cancel culture, speaking up against this radical land back agenda, speaking up against DEI and all the horrible identity politics that's dividing us as a society, like all of those things that I've been active in speaking up about. Those were all really hard to do at the time I was doing them. And it wasn't just speaking about them, it was actively doing them, right? It was forming that publication with others. It was being one of the early on the board of like a public land use society that advocated for public access to public land and an end to the NDP's land back agenda. It's putting my money where my mouth is on issues that are very, very difficult at the time, because we're going to need that same political will. We're going to need that same courage when it comes to doing some of the things I'm talking about doing now, which is, including repealing DRIPA, properly protecting private property rights, pulling the activism out of schools, and so on. Like, these are not going to be easy things to do, and we better have someone at the helm who was saying it not just when it was easy today, but back when it was hard.
Well, Caroline Elliott, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was fun.
Well, this sums up our interview. I want to know what you think, so put your comments down below. I do read these comments and they help inform my journalism. Be sure you're subscribed. If you like the interview, then give a thumbs up and consider getting a paid subscription for less than $5 a month, because I don't take a dime in government subsidies. And stay tuned for more videos coming soon. Until then, God bless.